we try to identify brands and brands identify us as a platform to help tell their story in a different way that's accepted by our communities.
Boom. Welcome back to this week's edition of the Campaign Mode Podcast. I am your host, Dan Bennett. And the Campaign Mode Podcast, for those that you don't know, and shame on you if you don't know, I'm just kidding. The Campaign Mode Podcast is our chance to dissect the world that lives between gaming and brands, the intersection of gaming and brands and gaming, business and gamers. Gaming is one of the fastest growing industries in the world, and how brands help propel that authentically is fascinating, and there's massive opportunity there. Likewise, how gamers work with brands is a great opportunity for them to professionalize what it is they're passionate about. So that's what we do on this particular show, whether you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on your podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. If you haven't liked and subscribed, please do. Sign up so you know when there's more of this stuff to come. On today's episode, we have a brilliant gaming insider, the Director of Global Brand Partnerships for ESL Gaming, Eli McCarrel. Eli talks about some of his history prior to ESL and gets into his last few years of being the global brand lead, brand partnership lead at the Esports League. Listen, you don't need to hear any more from me. That's enough waffle. I'm going to hand over to Zoom Dan, Zoom Eli. Enjoy.
Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome back to the Campaign Mode Podcast. And today I'm very proud, very happy to have my mate, Eli McCarrel, on the podcast with me. Eli, thanks, bud.
Thanks for having me.
Firstly, Eli actually lives down the road from me, but obviously we're still social distancing. So here I am in my basement, and you're actually in a lovely lit room, which is beautiful. Eli is the Director of Global Brand Partnerships at ESL Gaming. So you can see now why I'm thrilled to have him on. I'm going to ask Eli to go into some detail about that. But ESL Gaming, essentially, and I'm probably going to butcher some of this, Eli, so I'm going to ask you to go back and do a proper pro job of this. But essentially, pretty broad field of services in esports and gaming technology, storytelling, event management, advertising, television production, basically fully catering to the needs of like the esports system. Ecosystem. Have I roughly got that about right?
Yeah, I think so. You're
all right.
Perfect.
Pretty pro intro there.
Yeah.
So at the beginning of there is a line at the beginning of on the site, on the ESL Gaming site, which we'll link to in the podcast notes. But there's a fantastic line in there that says that ESL sets out to create more opportunity for progression and participation than any other sport.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to our manifesto, our mission statement of we create a world where everybody can be somebody. And I think that goes to show with the products we build, the communities we're working to build. And at our core, we're trying to create as much opportunity for anybody, for you or I, to start our esports career tomorrow, whether that's through the ESL Mobile Open, ESEA, which is an online Counter-Strike community. We've got all these different entry points into a professional career, and then we're building these pyramids with different tournaments and leagues to allow progression. So, you start in at the ground floor, you compete, you do a great job, you rank up, and then you're in that next kind of level of pyramid, and now you're competing against other semi-pro or other kind of, progressive amateur different teams. So
it's super impressive. It's interesting because it plugs in, I suppose, directly with, if you think like something on take Fortnite, for example, as a popular game, the arena, the arena ability of that, i.e. the contender series that pushes you up through the ranks as you get better and starts to push you into that world where you're not quite pro, but you might be in the same arena with some semi-pros and therefore getting walloped pretty quickly. But you guys definitely, as a leader in that sort of gaming experience, to some extent reflecting back on what's happening more broadly on the platforms, right?
Yeah, I think that our ultimate goal is not to create one opportunity, but to find as many entry points as possible, whether you're a competitive team or just someone by themselves starting out. What is the right opportunity to get in and create the right environment around them to flourish and advance?
So we dived in because I wanted to discuss that line with you because I loved it. It felt like such a progressive way of thinking about esports and gaming. But usually at the beginning of the podcast, I like to throw it over to our guests. So obviously in this case, you, to just do a little bit of a background on yourself. I know you have some experience more broadly in sport before ESL, but can you give us a couple minutes sort of intro to yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll make sure to give you the Cliff Notes version, not the long-winded version. So you kind of nailed it. I come from more of a traditional sports background, grew up playing sports, also grew up playing video games, which I think is important later on in my career and in my life, but grew up loving to play sports. I had 3 older brothers, so I always got beat up as a kid. Toughened me up a little bit, not too much. I was always kind of a softie, but I realized in high school that I wasn't going to, be a professional athlete. So decided to go the kind of the big university, big campus experience route and get involved there. So I actually held a internship at the University of Oregon, where I went to school with Sports Illustrated. So I got kind of this introduction into sports media. It was a print publication at the time that we were focused on. So learned about that side of the business a little bit in the kind of advertising world. And as I was on campus, I did a good job for them. So my junior year, they awarded me an internship in New York City, working with the brand directly. So, moved to, as a 21-year-old, fresh 21-year-old, moved to New York City from Oregon, and really soaked it up and kind of fell in love with it. So once I wrapped up college, New York was kind of always in my not long-term plan, but short-term plan. Like, I'd love to get back there. I shouldn't say the downside, because it wasn't a downside at all, is I was awarded an opportunity to work in Portland, Oregon, or actually in Beaverton, Oregon, with Nike at their world headquarters. So, I graduated college and started working pretty much the next Monday at Nike world headquarters. So, kind of a dream job right out of school, but it was an internship, and then it got extended into kind of more of a contract job. So,
I've worked with Nike. Funnily enough, it's funny you mentioned Nike, because I remember a few years ago, I started an agency, creative agency, and one of our early clients were Nike. And I vividly remember, and I'd worked at big agencies before, I vividly remember going out to the HQ, the World HQ, and just, I don't know whether it's like what actors feel like when they end up in Hollywood or something, but I just felt sort of like we'd made it. If my little agency was being taken seriously at Nike. So that must have been quite an experience for you as a pretty young guy.
Yeah, in my work, I've traveled to different places, as have you. As you drive into the campus, it's kind of like almost driving into like the Warner Brothers studio lot.
Right. Like,
it's a long driveway, like big trees everywhere, and then there's a little gate. Someone at the gate checking people in. Like, it's a very kind of almost like cinematic experience. And then once you get in, it's a huge lake in the middle, and you've got everyone's wearing Nikes, and you just feel the energy of all the smart people and innovation, creativity around you. And especially someone coming from the creative side, it's pretty
amazing.
Next level. But yeah, so to wrap up my career, worked at Nike, wanted to move back to New York. So I in 2008, started applying to different jobs. I started networking my tail off, got a job, entry-level sales job with Turner Sports, overseeing all of their television properties. So NBA on TNT, MLB on TBS, NASCAR, PGA Golf. And I was there for about 7 years. So in those 7 years, I worked on all those properties, and then eventually started working on March Madness and Bleacher Report. So I got this kind of really big, robust pro and college sports experience. And then 2014, moved to the West Coast to kind of be closer to family. Started a family, got married, was working with the Pac-12, which is a college conference, worked on all their properties, media network, and the conference championships. And while I was there, we actually started to think about launching a college esports program with all the Pac-12 universities. And being kind of the younger guy on my team, as I said, I had a little bit of a video game background. They pointed at me and said, "Hey, go help figure this thing out." And the Pac-12 is actually very wisely using ESL as kind of a consultative partner to launch the program. So I got introduced to everybody at ESL and more specifically Paul Brewer, who I'd worked with at Turner. We were good friends, but we were actually working together again at ESL and the Pac-12. And the conference didn't, or the Collegiate Esports League didn't end up taking off. But I stayed close to Paul about opportunities because I kind of learned about esports and kind of the upside and potential. And I was like, that as I think about the next 30 years of my career, that is something that I want to focus on because there's way too much opportunity in the space. And the last 2 years, I've learned a ton, and now I'm sitting on podcasts speaking on its behalf. It's kind of wild.
You are the voice of esports right now, at least as far as the Campaign Mode podcast goes.
I hope so, yeah.
Which is all you need. I mean, that is the voice of esports. So let's talk about. Thank you for that. It's a super interesting route. It makes lots of sense actually when I look at the sort of your narrative. All of those steps make tons of sense, and the pivot into gaming, smart one. So you find yourself at ESL. Can we talk a bit about what I know what it is because of how you and I have connected through my side of the world, the brand and marketing world, but the global brand partnership role. What sort of meetings does that put you in? What sort of role is that within the ESL organization?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So, like any company, generating revenue is super important. And we have a lot of different ways to do that, whether it's through when we're having events, ticket sales, merchandise, selling our media rights to our esports broadcasts. And my corner of that is partnerships and sponsorships. And at a very high level, it's, corporate partnerships, brands, but also, advertising, content. We have a lot of different, assets in our toolkit that we're able to create bespoke packages for partners to not only accomplish their objectives and their KPIs, but also add value to our broadcasts and our events, and then ultimately, above all, deliver value for our fans.
So that the purpose of this podcast, and the reason I started this podcast was it goes back to conversations you and I were having a couple months ago when you came to pay us a visit at the agency, and we were talking about brands and the opportunities within esports and with the ESL. But it's to do two things, right? One, it's to help our brand friends, the marketing guys out there, think about how to play a role, an authentic role. And we talk a lot about authenticity on this podcast, a role in gaming. The other side of the coin is how do up-and-coming gamers and pro gamers play a role, and how should they think about engaging with brands, right? How do they take their passion and professionalize it working with brands? So on one side of that, I want to talk to you a little bit about how you are seeing, or how ESL Gaming is seeing because I know you work with some of the biggest brands in the world. How are you seeing them engage with your properties, with what you guys are doing right now?
Yeah, so right now is a bit of a tricky time just because we've had to kind of alter our tournament formats a little bit. I mean, I think historically we've had kind of a multi-pronged approach, right? We've got this live event experience where fans can actually come watch our events, watch our tournaments live. From a brand standpoint, you're able to engage and interact with those fans. As it stands right now, ESL provides that opportunity. There's not too many opportunities to do that here in the U.S., especially, but globally in general. You look at, the NFL, NBA. There's dozens, or if not hundreds, of professional and college sports and games happening. So there's a lot of opportunity to do that. There's a lot less in esports, especially at a very high level when we're talking about big arenas and things like that. So that's one opportunity. The other opportunity is with our broadcast. We've had brand partners engage and get integrated in a variety of ways, whether it's through custom content creation using talent and influencers, or creating different segments that are elevating the broadcast experience and providing more value for the viewer, whether it's taking an inside look at a specific play that's happening, analyzing a specific map. We're bringing brands in that can contextually help tell that story. You think about more recently, one of our examples, Air Force, for example, all about tactics and strategy. It's core to their brand as the Air Force. They've come in and helped build a program where we're taking the timeout segment that's typically been a broadcast segment, where we kind of help fill time between maps, But Air Force has come in and said, okay, well, how can we create a more strategic discussion, leveraging Air Force's brand, from a marketing standpoint, and help tell and amplify that story and push it out socially. So, a brand that may not typically be accepted in esports is coming in and adding a ton of value to the broadcast in a very contextual way, or as you said, authentic. And that's super important. That's core to all the partnerships we do. We try to identify brands, and brands identify us as a platform to help tell their story in a different way that's accepted by our communities.
And that was one of the subjects of one of the hit points. We do a short form version of this called hit points, where I'll just focus on an element, a strategic point to focus on. Authenticity is a big one, but do you guys notice that you know real quick when something doesn't land with your audiences? Let's say, Air Force is a great example of a technical, tactical partner that makes sense in that setting. But I could think of a lot of brands that wouldn't work there. And presumably you guys look to massage and work out which are the right brands to put at the right point, which is not something that traditional broadcast does usually, right? Unless it's Super Bowl. But generally it's like, you want to buy the spot, you can buy the spot.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point. So ESL's been around for about 20 years. So in those 20 years, we've had a lot of trial and error, right? I haven't been around, obviously, for all 20, but we have so many learnings and so many case studies of brands that have come in, maybe not with ESL, but just in esports in general, and have either tried to do it themselves, or they try to convey a message that wasn't just real with that game or that community. So we've got all that information that we kind of take into consideration when we're talking to brands about entering into esports, because, you said, how do we, do we have any example? Like, we don't let that happen at this point, because we know where the pitfalls are, we know where the landmines are, and we have enough people at ESL, hundreds of people that work at ESL, that vet all the partner integrations that happen. And, the CEO of North America, Yvette, told me this when I started, 80% of our company, more or less, have only ever worked at ESL. So that's all they know.
Right.
ESL or esports, basically in our kind of little circle. So, we rely on them. I come from a partnership background, so I bring the brands to the table. I've got all their objectives. I kind of know what they're trying to accomplish, what their budget is, all that stuff. And then I bring in the experts and say, okay, how can we marry these two things in an authentic way that delivers just immense value for the brand, builds value for ESL, and then delivers value to our fans.
So that's you guys represent something quite unique in that regard, but I think partly because of your scale, but also because of the background of the guys on the team, guys and girls on the team, as you referenced. What about when it comes to engaging with brands and agencies? So how do you work on, I'm assuming you don't work on the sort of live briefs, so maybe you do, but how do you make sure that you're imparting the value and what's important within the esport world and community to that agency as they think about developing ideas for a brand?
Yeah, so this is more of a personal answer, not
personal's fine.
The corporate answer.
Yeah.
Paul and Mark Cohen and Craig Levine and even Yvette, the people that all are on our leadership team here in North America, they hired a bunch of people that hustle. So my job since I've been here is not only to bring in brand partners, but to evangelize and just sell ESL and create as much brand awareness here in the US as possible. So I've taken relationships from previous companies with agencies, with brands, or whoever else, and have really just tried to sit down with them and talk to them about esports and ESL, because there's so much learning that needs to happen with brands and agencies, and part of my job was to, number one, be an expert as fast as possible, and two, get as many meetings as possible and just and have those conversations from a brand brief standpoint. We're not in that kind of transactional media world where we could get a call on a Friday, hey, we need to run some spots starting Monday, can we pipe you into the broadcast? It's not how we work. Our job is to plant a seed call it in January, and keep the dialogue happening, continue to educate, and then hopefully that seed bears fruit for all of us, a year later. Like that's kind of the sales cycle of what we're talking about.
It's interesting that long. So, when I think about this with the agency hat on, and for the folks that are on the, deep in that brand side of things, the long tail relationship piece to this, the ability to be able to connect to your team, decently in advance of a brand activation, is something that is a sort of a top tip coming out of this, right? Like if you really want to be authentic in that regard, take the Air Force, right? The Air Force is an example.
Yeah.
That didn't happen overnight. They realized at a certain point they had a horizon, an event horizon that they had to activate X in the future, and probably got you guys in on that conversation well in advance of whatever it was, the particular event you were broadcasting. So that's something definitely to bear in mind, because all too often agencies, as you know and you mentioned, we can spend a lot of our time doing those things that are a bit more knee-jerk, and especially right now in the face of COVID stuff, we're trying to obviously put out a lot of fires on that front. I want to talk about the other side of that coin that I mentioned earlier, which is the gamer, right? So you guys provide the forum, the event, the platform and experience, but how does ESL interact and engage with the teams? As you know, we had Andy Miller, the owner of Energy, on here a couple of weeks ago. He was talking to us about energy, and he was also talking to us about his experience as the owner of Sacramento Kings, right? There's a lot of overlap there. But how do you guys, as the provider of the event and experience, engage with the teams? Is there a lot of engagement there?
Absolutely. I mean, we have a dedicated team at ESL, which, is, I think that we call them player management. So their job is to have relationships and build relationships with different teams and organizations. I think, the history of ESL and the way we've treated our players and our teams has been super positive. So, teams view ESL as an opportunity for them to compete against each other, win prize money, build their own brands, right? Like, you look at the Team Liquids of the world, the part of their brand building is through their success at ESL tournaments. So, we rely on each other, provided that, we're getting the right teams to compete in our events. But
right.
No, 100%. We've got great relationships with teams, and with players specifically. It kind of goes back to our kind of our rally cry that where everybody can be somebody. ESL is kind of viewed as the platform for opportunity. So if I want to start my esports career, I'm going to look to what ESL is doing in that space or with that game, and potentially pursue it, because we've got opportunities for most games at the kind of ground level, all the way up.
Yeah, I want to change gears a little bit, because you hit on it earlier, and we can't avoid it, frankly. The current state of the world, which, knock wood, it looks like we might be coming out, there's some light at the end of the tunnel. But how have you seen, pertinent to ESL, right, what your guys' business is, but generally in respect to gaming, how have you seen that world change in relation to this current coronavirus lockdown situation? We know the numbers are going up, but how are you guys dealing with it? Because obviously you deal with events as well. You deal with that live experience.
Yeah, there's two sides to that, right? We lose the live event aspect, which is so important for ESL. I hate to say it's kind of our bread and butter, is to put on these live arena-based events. We fill stadiums, we fill convention centers. We don't have that right now. So we've had to kind of pivot our strategy a little bit. We've obviously been pouring all of our resources into our broadcasts and making sure that that's just completely buttoned up. I think we've been forced to innovate a ton through remote broadcasts. So we have talent and analysts doing broadcasts remotely either from home like this or from a remote studio. So that's been the short-term impact. I think we're taking it, kind of quarter by quarter. We haven't completely gone online only for the rest of the year. We're still anticipating to be back in arenas, obviously, at some point, hopefully sooner than later. But yeah, we've been focused on our broadcasts.
Yeah.
How can we drive as much value for our brand partners? Kind of tie it back to the podcast. How can we bring that level of engagement and interaction that we're doing at these festivals or at these events online and socially? So that's what we've been forced to kind of come up with really creative ideas and some things that we're excited to announce.
It's going to be fascinating when we come out the other side of this to see how your business evolves with the new numbers we're going to be talking about, right? You think about a young guy or a girl that might have spent the last, 12 weeks embedding themselves in something like Warzone or Overwatch or Apex or whatever it might be, whatever these platforms are. They will, they're going to come out pretty well schooled in it because of the amount of time they've had to apply themselves to it. So I think keeping an eye on that, and the world will reopen. You guys are going to go back to filling those big arenas, but it feels like you're going to be dealing with an audience size that's dramatically bigger, and it was already growing. So I think that's going to be fascinating. Is there anything in the last few weeks outside of the old COVID situation in the gaming world that's been big news that's caught your eyes? One of the things, it's a few weeks ago now, but I riffed on a couple of podcasts ago, was Travis Scott's event, right? That weird premiere experience, live experience in platform. Anything else that struck you recently that's worth of note?
Yeah, that one's super interesting, and especially in current times. Like, I remember all the esports publications, podcasts, they had so much content coming out of that. It's like, is this the future of live concerts? Like, there was all this content that kind of was generated from that Fortnite Travis Scott collaboration. I mean, I think it's fascinating. I think that was probably one of the earlier highlights from a gaming standpoint. Warzone also blew up. Valorant, both of those games blew up, the last couple months, just because everybody's playing them more. Viewership, I think, on Twitch for Valorant has been super high. From an esports standpoint, there was some talk early on. I remember seeing a bunch of memes online of like, esports is the new sports. Esports is here to stay. Like, now we've been here. We've been doing this for 20 years. I think for us, we've just kept our nose down, kept our head down, and we're just continuing to kind of keep pushing out, premium, just high-class content. I think from a news and trade publication standpoint, the sports betting, I think that's kind of the not unspoken, but the thing that we'll be talking about in the next few years. I think it was William Hill or some different Nevada sports books started taking bets for different esports competitions, including ESL competitions, some of our Counter-Strike and Dota tournaments. So that's going to be super fascinating. The daily fantasy, industry is going to be super fascinating. The DraftKings, the Monkey Knife Fights of the world, what are they going to be doing? I think I read an article a couple weeks ago that one of the daily fantasy sites has seen an uptick in wagers like 30x or some crazy number. I mean, we're experiencing broadcast, lifts, double our viewership from previous seasons, things like this. I mean, they're receiving 30 times the amount of money that's being invested in esports daily fantasy. So, I think that's the thing that is going to be super interesting is as we think about traditional sports, and like our teams and leagues going to now start developing relationships, which they kind of are already, with the MGMs of the world, with the daily fantasy sites of the world, and what's that going to look like 3 to 5 years from now? Because I think what we've learned in the last couple months is you can't necessarily convert an NFL fan into being a Counter-Strike fan. Like, that's just a tough thing to sell. But you can convince someone who's making bets on an NFL game, once they don't have that, like, oh, there's what's this Counter-Strike thing? Let me learn about it. Right. And, that's a little bit easier of a transition. So I think that's where we're going to see a shift in kind of the overall kind of esports and gaming world is the sports betting space.
It's funny because one of the things we've discussed on here in the past has been this interesting transition or overlap between professional sports people and the gaming world, right? The ability for one of the stars of the Cowboys or one of the stars of the Sacramento Kings or whomever it might be to connect with guys like you and Andy and whomever else to try and find their way into a more professional gaming experience with their esport athlete brothers and sisters. That overlap's really interesting because suddenly you might start seeing, like you mentioned, just because I'm a fan of the Dallas Cowboys or NFL, it's unlikely I'm going to be a Dota fan. But if suddenly I know that, whomever the quarterback for that team is, Now I'm showing my weakness when it comes to, you know, information on NFL teams. But still, that overlap does start to become quite interesting to me. There is a dynamic area in there, especially as I think about it from a brand point of view, which could be quite compelling.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing now, and you're seeing a lot of it, especially with the NBA players. Like there was a couple weeks where, you know, a lot of NBA athletes were playing Warzone with celebrities, and a lot of that more or less is entertainment, right? It's casual. You're not playing for prize money. You know, Ben Simmons isn't playing in these tournaments so he can like get to the next level of his playing career, of his esports career. You know, I think what would really be funny is if you get that, you know, kind of young NBA player that may not make the cut in the NBA, or maybe he's kind of a fledgling, you know, going from the G League up to the NBA, like he's kind of a not quite there. He says, skip this, I'm going to go be a pro, you know, Call of Duty player. And the next thing you know, he's made the roster for the Call of Duty. Like that's when you're going to start seeing that intersection of esports and pro gamers, because right now a lot of it's just kind of entertainment and it's just for fun.
Yeah, it's coming. I feel there was a storyline on Ballers about that, right? There's a football player. It's coming now. Yeah. I feel like there's something in the water there. So let me wrap up. We're coming up on half an hour, which I like to try not to monopolize too much of your time beyond that. But let's leave it with I want to leave it on the sort of brand side of things and talk a bit about where you're seeing, and it could be pertinent to ESL, could be pertinent to more broader gaming, but where are you seeing the most progressive brands helping to sort of push this brand platform relationship forward? What would you be thinking if you were a brand in terms of how you can tap into this world?
Yeah, I think brands that know where their audiences are have a head start. You look at Nike recently, not to go back to Nike, but they did this huge thing with Luka Doncic, where they kind of gamified Luka and they created some content around that with Foot Locker. You know, Nike has a stranglehold on sneaker culture, right? So they created, with the shoe launch, they gamified the experience. They know that, you know, they need to reach this gaming audience. So they gamified kind of what they were doing. So I think Nike is just one example, but it's understanding where your audiences are and how can you kind of create fun content or build content around that. You know, I think also, you know, with esports being so new, you look at the opportunity to come in at the ground floor of something. And brands that understand that they have the opportunity to come in at the ground floor and start to build something kind of goes back to our philosophy as it relates to partnerships about building something long term. So you can really come in at this kind of ground floor and start to build. It's not coming in and buying a spot in the Super Bowl. It's the apex. You're in, you're out. Maybe there's some ancillary content around it. But it's coming in, you're helping build an ecosystem. Maybe it's through an amateur tournament, I hate to say it, but something like the ESL Mobile Open, and then helping develop, you know, that ecosystem from the ground up. I think that is super interesting. Yeah. But the flip side of that is you got to, you know, lean on experts, and you got to really do as much homework as you can. As a brand or as an agency, you can't go it alone. You got to hire well, or talk to the right properties to have those conversations.
You know, you sound like you've been listening to the Campaign Mode podcast, dude, because that has been one of the drums I've been banging, which is about, if you don't know it, hire people that do, and make sure you're working with 100%. The right guys and the right partners. So listen, we're right up on time. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I want to get you back when the world's reopened so we can talk about some of the upcoming events. But I want to thank Eli McCarrel from ESL Gaming. I want to thank you for joining us today on the Campaign Mode podcast. Thanks, bud.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay. Eli McCarrel, everybody. I want to thank Eli for joining us on the show today, giving us half an hour of his time. I know he's a super busy guy, so that's very much appreciated. And I hope you guys got something out of it. We'll have Eli back on the show when the world opens up, and they've got the ESL have got some new events to talk about, so we'll have him come in and talk specifically about those. I want to do some housekeeping with you, right? You know, this is like the pro podcaster thing to do, isn't it? To say, okay, what have we got coming up? Well, coming up, we have more of these longer form interviews with some, I'm very happy to say, super interesting people. Next week, we have a guy coming on who works for the world's largest gaming streaming platform. In between those big shows, we also have something we call Hit Points, which is 3-minute strategic insight into an individual topic to do with the relationship between gaming and brands, and how brands can take gaming to their heart and how gamers can work with brands. Anyway, they come up once or twice a week, and they're probably well worth a little listen to because they're only 3 minutes long, right? So there's plenty you can do for 3 minutes, and then also you can absorb that stuff. Makes you smarter, hopefully. Like, subscribe, sign up, notify, get those bells ringing when we upload new stuff, and then you'll be able to keep on top of what we have coming out of the channel or on the podcast. That's really it. Stay well, stay sane. Hopefully the world's getting back to normal a little bit. But in the meantime, I want to thank you for listening. It does mean a lot. I very much appreciate it. And I'll see you next week on the Campaign Mode podcast.